Welcome to this edition of The American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on his work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they've generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org, and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, Rabbi Shai Held. Shai is the president of Hadar, a contemporary yeshiva and social activism center in New York, based on traditional Jewish values with a modern approach, and in my opinion, one of the most talented teachers in our tradition. He's been my teacher, and now he'll be yours. Shai, welcome to the American Purpose.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, I want to dive right in and start with the first question. In your opinion, what was the original national purpose of the United States of America?
So much as I'm allergic to cliches, I want to start with this. America was founded to be a land of freedom and opportunity. Now, I think if we want to move beyond the cliche, our commitment to freedom was bound up with our professed commitment to equality. And that's where the rub is, because this has historically obviously been our greatest stumbling block. We have talked about how, quote, all men are created equal. And that, of course, excluded women, obviously, and also African Americans who were considered in some sense less than human. And all of that is before we talk about the history of the damage we did, the unimaginable damage we did to indigenous peoples in this country. So on the one hand, the founding purpose of America is all about being bound up with equality. On the other hand, in a certain sense, we're just getting started down that road.
So what do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward, given what you've just said about our origins?
Well, so I would say two things. I mean, I probably could say many things about this, but let me say two for now. One is, I think we need to double down on what it means to take equality seriously and what it means to build a society in which all Americans matter equally. I mean, we live in a time when the voting rights of many Americans are under threat. That has to be fundamental to our purpose, that, you know, what it means to be a free person in a democracy is to have an equal say in the unfolding of the country and its future. But I also want to say something else in a somewhat different but related direction, which is that an overemphasis on freedom can stem from, and I think both lead to, right, can feed into this cycle with a very atomized conception of what we are as individuals, which leaves us, by the way, as sociologists like to point out, isolated, lonely, disconnected. And so I think beyond being focused on America being a free society, our purpose ought to be to create America as a caring society, as a society where those who are vulnerable and downtrodden and desolate are cared for, a society where we talk about, you know, in the last year and a half, we've talked a lot about essential workers. Can we have a society in which those we have deemed essential actually earn a living wage and are able to support their own families? So I think both, you know, that the project of equality remains to be pursued in a serious way, and also that we need to not overemphasize freedom to the extent that we forget about what it means to have a society built on solidarity and human connection and a sense of mutual responsibility.
Well, I'm glad to hear you introduce the word responsibility, because I know in lots of conversations that you and I have had, most of which you've initiated, there is a tension in the Jewish tradition between individual autonomy and the responsibilities that we hold as a covenantal community. Can you talk about how that might apply in the American context?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because we're talking about translating religious ideals into a non-sectarian space. So on the one hand, I think more than a Jewish community, an American community ought to err on the side of freedom. But I think you know, maybe we could put it this way: church and state ought to remain separate, but religion and society ought to be integrated. And we need to find ways to convince people that they are missing out on something fundamental, that they are depriving their kids of something fundamental if they do not raise them with a sense of social responsibility. I think at the end of the day, if moral education is about anything, it's about a sense that the suffering of other people is my responsibility. That happens to dovetail beautifully with Judaism, and I'm glad to say it dovetails with many religious traditions, which is a good thing, because there's a tremendous amount of suffering in the world and not a lot of Jews in the world. And so the more religions we have that are willing to embrace the discourse of responsibility and talk to people about what it means to be citizens in a modern society, the more the merrier and the better, because we need all the help we can get.
So I'll warn you, we're going to circle back to that in a couple of minutes.
Great.
But I want to focus for a minute on some of the foundational values of American society. Some of them are admirable and some of them not so much. Mm-hmm. What are one or two of the values in American society that are worth doubling down on?
Well, here, at the risk of becoming a broken record, I do want to talk about equality again. And here, I say this because I think that religion potentially has an important role to play in instilling a commitment to genuine equality. One of the most interesting discussions in moral and political philosophy over the last few decades has been the question of whether and how secular systems of philosophy can ground a commitment to human equality. What is it based in? Where does it come from? And what some human rights theorists have argued is actually it's vestigial on God. What grounds our commitment to equality is our commitment to the idea that every human being is created in the image of God and is therefore infinitely valuable and equally infinitely valuable. So I underscore equality both because it's fundamental to our project and because I actually think this is a place where people who claim to take religion seriously have a very special role to play, which is to insist, you cannot be a religious person and seek to rob people of their voting rights because it furthers whatever agenda you might have. You cannot be a person who's fine with I've been thinking a lot about a study recently that showed that when African American, when the social scientists would send out resumes with a stereotypically white name and the same resume with a stereotypically black name, right? The white name was worth, they estimated, 5 years of experience. You cannot claim to be a religious person who believes in human beings created in the image of God and see that as tolerable. And that's a fundamental responsibility I think we have. I would also mention another value that I think we ought to double down on. I just took my kids for the first time on the Circle Line last week, which is this, boat ride around New York City. And, we kind of came up close to the Statue of Liberty. And, the Jewish tradition and the American tradition here dovetail beautifully. The Jewish tradition talks about loving the stranger, welcoming the outsider who comes seeking opportunity and safety. This is a country that ought to double down on its commitment to immigrants and what they can contribute to the society and what the society can contribute to them. As Hamilton has it, immigrants, they get the job done. I think it's actually really fundamental that we do that. We are living in a moment right now, I don't need to tell you this, obviously, but we're living in a moment right now around the world where xenophobia and hatred of immigrants is rampant. And I mean, we've just endured a presidency that was built on xenophobia and opposition to immigrants. And I think fundamentally that's a piece of our legacy we need to reclaim. We ought to be worthy of the Statue of Liberty that we see in New York. And we have not always been worthy of it.
I hear you making an argument based on values and not economics. Because the argument of those people who are a little bit to the right of where you and I might find ourselves is that, as Hamilton says, immigrants get the job done. And so there's a value to our economy by bringing in so-called productive immigrants. But if this is a foundational value of compassion, that's a very different approach.
Well, I would say, I am not a policy analyst, but my impression is that actually we need low-wage workers in this country too. So even on an economic level, letting in low-income, low-wage, what we call horribly low-skilled workers, is actually an economic value as well. But yes, I am arguing in my role as a religious teacher, it's my responsibility to talk about how there's no greater interest we have than pursuing our values. Something that the late Leonard Fine used to say, right? There's no greater Jewish value. There's no greater Jewish interest in the pursuit of Jewish values. And I think that's true about religion in general. And so I feel like it's our responsibility as clergy, as educators, to actually make the case for a compassionate society. That's what a caring society is.
Are there any values you could identify, even one or two, that are holding us back from the necessary progress we need to make as a society?
Well, so let me go back to a couple of things that I said earlier that I could maybe expand upon. One, I think that when we talk about freedom in ways that undercut mutual responsibility, we are in very big trouble. I mean, we have lived through in the last year. I mean, imagine that the notion of wearing a mask to protect yourself and others from a pandemic is a political issue. That's almost unfathomable when you just take a step back and realize the sheer moral absurdity of it, right? I mean, you can keep other people alive by wearing a mask, and you don't do it because you have some very odd notion of liberty as freedom from all constraint. That's not a mature or adult conception of freedom, frankly. So I think we need to find ways to overcome this kind of ugly edge of libertarianism that we've seen. That doesn't mean all libertarianism is ruled out, but there's a kind of ugly edge to it that we need to really find a way to overcome. I would also say, in a funny way, I hear this less than I used to, but one story we tell about ourselves, or at least part of our society, white society at least, tells about itself that needs to be jettisoned, is the myth that we have overcome racism. I'll never forget, it was a very jarring moment for me sitting with parents of, when I have little kids, when you have little kids, you end up sitting with the parents of your kids' friends. And very nice guy said to me, this was about 7 or 8 years ago, look, it's totally clear to me that in this day and age, racism doesn't hold anyone back in this country. And this is not, by the way, someone who is a obviously racist, not, a right-wing extremist, just fundamentally someone who is misinformed. And one of the things I said to him is, there is an ocean of social scientific literature that proves you wrong. What you're saying is not an opinion, it's a falsity, right? There is an ocean of literature demonstrating that that's not true. And we Americans have so often wanted to take shortcuts around the racism problem to sort of convince ourselves that we have overcome what we have not even yet begun to deal with. I think often about, Vincent Harding, who was one of, Martin Luther King's closest compatriots. Vincent Harding, who used to love to ask audiences, is America still possible? Which is just a wonderful provocative formulation. Is America still possible? And I'd like to believe America is still possible, but in order to do that, we have to tell the truth about ourselves, which is that we are at once a great country that has achieved enormous things and a country that has really failed to take the message of human equality that we claimed to be based on seriously enough. And that's going to require letting go of the myth that we are everything we've claimed to be. No one is ever everything they claim to be. And we are no exception in that way. And so the question is, will we take on the task of becoming that?
Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality and what we have to share in order to move us forward. But the first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal. It's the freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience. What values rooted in your personal belief system do you commend to those who don't share those beliefs?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. So I guess I'll start by saying two things. One is that I think in a moment when our climate and therefore our planet are at grave peril, some notion of Sabbath, which is about stopping the never stopping train of consumption is enormously important. The notion that there is a time in which we recognize our status as creatures rather than as masters of the universe, where we see the world as a gift rather than a resource for consumption and production, that I think is really fundamental. Now, what that will look like, I think, can take all kinds of different forms. But I think some notion of Sabbath, right? We are about in the Jewish calendar to enter a sabbatical year, a year that's traditionally about letting the land rest. So there's something there. And I'm glad to see some Christians, Walter Brueggemann and others, really writing about the centrality of finding ways in our culture to have Sabbath, to say stop, to actually be willing to say enough. In many ways, the spiritual practice of Shabbat is simply about resting in the fullness of what is, rather than grasping for more and more. And unless we as a country, but more expansively as a human race, learn to do that, we and the world we inhabit are both in very grave peril. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing, and it just kind of like follows through the thread of what we've been talking about. I've spent a lot of time in recent years trying to understand the biblical idea of humans being created in the image of God in the context of the ancient Near East, where that idea emerged. And there's one particular aspect of Genesis's idea that I find honestly breathtaking and overpowering, frankly. And that is when you know that all over the ancient Near East, the king of a society was known as the image of the God of that society. Then you begin to realize what Genesis 1 has done, which is this radical democratization and egalitarianization of the idea of royalty. If only a king is an image of God, then what Genesis 1 says is that we are all royalty. Every last one of us is a king. The king is not supposed to be the ruler over everybody else from creation. We are all, on some level, kings and queens in some very fundamental and irreducible sense. And I always find myself wondering, what would it mean to conduct my personal life as if every human being I encountered anywhere was royalty? I say this to my kids sometimes. How would you react if the president of the United States walked into the room? And they say, I would sit up and I would show respect. As I said, now imagine that every person you ever meet deserves that level of respect. What would that mean? How would our politics change? How would our society change? How would discussions of public policy change? How would discussions of economics be different? There's so much we can learn from this very basic biblical ideal. Every last one of us is royalty. And frankly, we have to, I think, as religious people, to live in the chasm between that theological claim and the empirical reality of the world around us. What does it mean to say that every human being on the face of the earth is royalty, while some people in the richest country in the history of the world lie in their urine every night and sleep on the street? Or what does it mean to take that seriously? That is a theological question. These questions are political, but they're also theological. They're about, how do we live up to the ideals we claim to hold? Both, I always think about, America has some lofty ideals, Judaism has some lofty ideals. Together, there's some pretty lofty ideals that we have to strive to live up to. And that's the project of being, I think, a religious American. But frankly, an American of any kind, an American who's inherited a culture where the Bible has been so influential.
I'm just curious, have you ever found yourself in the physical presence of a king or the equivalent of a king or a queen?
I've been in the presence of the president of the United States. And I don't know if this was your experience. I think I may have been in the presence of a president of the United States in the same time as you at one point. But I remember very vividly standing in the White House and watching these very wealthy, powerful men jostling around, chatting with each other as if they own the place. And then the door opens and President Obama walks in and there's an audible gasp of, oh, a person with tremendous power and authority just walked in. It was really very moving. Is that different from your experience?
No. And in fact, just because of the circles I run in, I've met the King of Jordan, and my wife actually, when we were tour guides at Universal Studios, gave a tour to a young man who is now the King of Morocco. So there
I was an undergrad at Harvard when I was the rabbi there. Is that possible?
It's possible. It's entirely possible. You're right. There is something palpable that is attached to someone who holds that title that is
Mm-hmm.
hard to describe, but unquestionable in its effect on the individual. And it's an intriguing notion that you have that we should feel that sense of, for lack of a better word, awe when we're in the presence of someone else. It won't be a surprise to you to hear this said, but it's very Hegelian to think in those terms.
Well, it's very Hegelian because it's very biblical.
Right, right. So, Shai, how do you think that society should pursue our national purpose? Is there a program we can engage to do this?
So I think one thing that I would say here is we have to be committed in the most fundamental way to the kind of moral education that teaches our kids both empathy and human solidarity, because without that, we truly have nothing. We can't talk about equality without talking about a sense of solidarity. We can't talk about a caring society without talking about empathy. So if we want to move any of this forward, there is an elementary sense of moral education we need to engage in. Solidarity, the sense that the fate of other people, not just people in my religious community, not just people in my ethnic group, not just people in my tax bracket, right? That people qua people, and in this context, Americans qua Americans, that we are each other's responsibility. And I guess you can teach that to adults, but it seems to me you have a much better shot when you're committed to that when people are younger, when people grow up and have a sense of what it means to have a sense of what in Judaism is called arivut, of mutual responsibility. I think I also would want to find ways, and I know there's lots of debates about what this could and should or couldn't and shouldn't look like, but we have to find ways to ingrain in this country a sense of service being obligatory. And that includes the military, obviously, but it goes beyond that. On some level, every kid who grows up should have some sense of, this society needs me for something. There's something I can contribute. And that's also, by the way, a great way for people to derive some sense of meaning for their own life, right? They're actually getting something in the giving. And what that can look like, is that a nationally mandated program? I don't know. I leave that in some ways wiser and more, more sophisticated policy thinkers than I obviously am. But some sense of the restoration of service as fundamental to what it means to be an American. That requires also some sense of not just freedom from, but also freedom for, freedom to contribute to this society as a full member with unique gifts and unique possibilities of contributing.
It comes back to the theme of responsibility that you were talking about earlier as well.
Right.
So maybe that's part of the answer to the next question, but if that's what society has to do, what role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose?
Well, so I'm going to start minimalist. The first stage, of course, is political in the sense of starting with voting. You have equal rights, use them. You have the ability to shape the future of this country, make sure that they are exercised, and that you see that as at once a privilege and a responsibility. One of the things that I love about Jewish spirituality is that things really can be a privilege and a responsibility at the same time. And I think that this is a very powerful way of thinking about this. But more, on some level, more radically, we each of us have a voice. And there is always the temptation to conform, to go along, to get along. But what it means to speak up and remember that elected officials work for us, and what it means to actually tell them what it is that we expect and want of them. One of the things that was very important to me, and I hope this is not too much of a digression, but one of the things that was very important to me in my own involvement in protests around police brutality was my sense that it wasn't optional, because the police work for me. My tax dollars pay their salary, so that when a police officer goes rogue and ends up killing an innocent African-American kid, right, they're acting on my behalf. And that is utterly unconscionable. And I have to find a way to use my voice to speak up and say, this is not what you were hired to do. And I think the same thing applies to, members of Congress. You were not hired to be in the pocket of whatever, the pharmaceutical industry. You were hired to represent us. This is what your job is. And that involves speaking up and protesting when necessary. And then I would also say practically, this goes back to what I was just talking about a moment ago, volunteering and service. If you want this country to be a country where every kid has an equal opportunity, and at this moment, not every kid has an equal opportunity, how can you equalize the opportunity of some kids right now? If you want this to be a country that's a caring society and you see Alzheimer's patients who are abandoned with no one to visit them, it is in your hands to make this a society that is a little bit more like that. Human beings alone can't utterly transform the world, but they can change it for the better. And that's our challenge, every day of our lives. When we die, will the world have been a kinder, more caring place for our having been here? I mean, I don't know what's more fundamental than that.
So let me bait you just a little bit about the second answer you gave, about demanding that public servants know that we're the public and they work for us. That is indeed what some of the people who showed up 6 months ago at the United States Capitol were saying when they wanted members of Congress to, in their opinion, do the right thing. What do you say to those people who were busy chanting, "You work for us"?
So that's a wonderful question, right? I mean, look, structurally, they're right that the members of Congress work for them. But the problem is when you have been, this is where society is so complicated. One of the things we haven't talked about is, in order for America to achieve its purpose, I'm not sure we can have media networks who spend all their time feeding people lies, feeding untruths. I mean, the problem with the protest was its violence and disrespect for our nation's symbols and its leaders, but also the fact that it was all based on a series of preposterous lies. So it is of course complicated. And the pushback is actually very helpful and very important. But I don't think the answer to that is to say, no, members of Congress don't work for you. We have to do a better job of being the you who members of Congress work for.
Good. All right, last question, Shai. Are you optimistic about America's future?
Well, I think if I were going to be really honest, I would say it depends on the hour and the day that you ask me. If I were trying to be a little more substantive about that, I would say, I always say this in terms of Jewish philosophy. I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I'm a possibilist. In that, I think, to go back to that Vincent Harding quote, America is still possible. We can be a country that is worthy of its name. We can be a country that is about freedom and opportunity and equality and caring and empathy and solidarity. We can be those things, but we have a very uphill climb. I mean, I think to be very explicit, and I hope a way that's okay, first of all, the Trumpian fever has to break, right? Without that fever breaking, I'm not sure how we move forward. We've got to find a way to have that fever break. And we've got to convince people that we are not mortal enemies, but actually mutual citizens of a country that's also a project. America has always been not just a country, but also an idea. And that's an idea that we share in common, or we go down together. I think on some level, it's that simple. But that simple thing to say is enormously hard to enact. And that's a challenge that we face. That's why hundreds of years later, we're still in certain aspects of our national purpose at the very beginning. But I will say this, whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, it is forbidden to give up. That's one of the places where I think, Judaism, and I suspect other religions too, are very important in this way. Despair is not an option. Despair is an act of entitlement. We don't have a right to despair when there are children who are hungry and people sleeping in the street. We have an obligation to responsibility and not despair.
Wonderful. Shai, tell people where they can find more of your writing if they want to hear more from you.
Two quick places to start, thank you, are on the Hadar website, www.hadar.org. www.hadar.org/Shai Held. You can find a lot of my writing there, and also a 2-volume collection of writings on the Torah, on the Hebrew Bible, called The Heart of Torah. Those are probably the two of the best spaces. Also on the Hadar website, there's lots of opportunities for podcasts and listening to lectures, and hope
Great.
you'll find me there.
It's worthwhile. Everyone who's watching this should take a look. Thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us and exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Shai Held, who has shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes of at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.